Welcome. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Everyone is touched by psychiatric conditions, either themselves or a loved one. Do not suffer in silence. With help, there is hope. Today, on Healthy Minds.
The sad part is judges tend to see more people with serious mental illnesses and probably psychiatrists these days because our systems have failed so miserably. And so what's happened is the criminal justice system has clearly become the default system for people with mental illnesses. And it is the same problem for every jail in the United States.
That's today on Healthy Minds. Healthy Minds is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the Graham Beck Foundation, the New York State Psychiatric Association, and the New York State Office of Mental Health. One of the saddest and most tragic aspects of mental illness is when a person becomes involved in the criminal justice system as a result of untreated or inadequately treated illness. Today I speak with Judge Stephen Leifman of Miami, Florida. Judge Leifman has worked to change the way people with mental illness are treated in the criminal justice system. Steve, you've done tremendous work as a judge to help people who have a mental illness and become involved in the criminal justice system.
The sad part is judges tend to see more people with serious mental illnesses and probably psychiatrists these days because our systems have failed so miserably. I have an odd, long story I'll make short. When I was about 17 years old, I was an intern for a state legislator who received a letter about a young man who was at our local state hospital. So my age kind of tracks the institutionalization, and I was asked to go to the hospital to see what we could do to help this young man. And it was a pretty traumatizing experience. You know, a 17-year-old kid, I had not seen anything terrible in my life. And what I saw there is pretty much why we ended up closing the hospitals. It turned out the young man who was strapped to a bed, who was being injected with antipsychotic medications, was probably 150 pounds overweight, was not psychotic, he was autistic. And we were able to get him out and put him on a path where he was able to have a much higher quality of life. But while I was there, I was given a tour of the facility, and they brought me downstairs to this room that looked like a cage. And there were 6 or 7 men lying naked in their own feces, and a guard was standing there washing them off with a hose. And, you know, it was like we treated animals at the zoo better than we were treating people.
And this was been shocking.
It was horrifying and shocking. So fast forward, I'm on the bench 15, 17 years later, and I'm in a division with low-level offenses for people that are still in custody, which is basically a lot of people with serious mental illnesses. And I encounter a really horrible case. In fact, before I actually got on the bench, the public defender and state attorney came to see me and asked me if I would speak to the parents of this young man who was in court that I was about to see. And they came in, they were lovely people, very sophisticated and horribly distraught. The mom was literally crying, the dad was shaking, and they started to beg me to get their son help. And at that point, judges had absolutely no training on how to identify people with mental illnesses, what to do with people with mental illnesses. We were pretty ignorant, and we were probably doing a lot of damage as a result. But anyway, they told me their son was brilliant. He had gone to Harvard. He had a late onset of schizophrenia and was now homeless and recycling through the criminal system in Miami, and they just didn't know what to do. And I was pretty young and naive and thought I had a lot more power and wisdom than I did. And I made the mistake of promising them that I would get their son help. And so as I started to go back into the courtroom, the mom stopped me and said, you know, there's one more thing I need to tell you about my son. She said, you know, not only is he brilliant, but he probably knows more about the system than you do. And I kind of looked at her funny, and she said, well, you see, my son is a psychiatrist that worked at Jackson Memorial Hospital. And so I was pretty taken back, and I went into the courtroom and I called his case, and he stood, and we started to have an amazing conversation. He was thoughtful, he was coherent, he was probably more respectful than the lawyers, And except for his appearance, he sounded every bit the Harvard-educated doctor they had described to me. And I was sitting there thinking, I don't get it. He seems fine to me, except, he looks a little disheveled and homeless, but doesn't seem sick. And so we started talking, and I said to him, do you mind if I ask you a question? He's like, anything, Your Honor. I said, I just don't understand one thing. You insist that there's absolutely nothing wrong with you, you don't have any kind of mental health issues, but why would a Harvard-educated doctor be in jail and homeless if he didn't have a serious mental illness? And whatever I said triggered a full-blown psychotic episode. He started shaking back and forth, he started cupping his ears, it was clear he was hearing voices, and all of a sudden, he got this look on his face that I will never forget. It was what someone must look like right before they think they're gonna die. And he started screaming in the courtroom at the top of his lungs, and he started pointing to the back of the courtroom where his parents were standing. And he started yelling, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor. And everything was like in sixes. You have to have that couple removed, you have to have that couple removed. And I said to him, well, aren't those your parents? And he's like, no, no, no. And he's screaming really loud. And he goes, my real parents, they died in the Holocaust. And these people are from the CIA and they came to kill me. And the only thing at that point you could hear was his mom crying. It was stunningly horrifying for everybody. And the only thing I knew to do at that point was to order a psychological evaluation. I didn't even know what I was supposed to do when the evaluation came back because, again, we had no training. And so 3 weeks went by, first evaluation came in, it said he was incompetent, needed immediate hospitalization, I had to get a couple more. He's in jail, 6 to 8 weeks on a ridiculous charge that someone without mental illness wouldn't see a minute in jail. And all 3 evaluations come back, they say he's incompetent, he needs to be hospitalized. I begin to order him into hospitalization, and the assistant public defender whips out a Florida Supreme Court case and tells me I have no authority to do anything with him because it's only a misdemeanor or low-level offense. And I had to release him. And I had to release him back to the street, floridly psychotic. And not only was I unable to fulfill the promise I made to his parents, I probably put him at risk, I put the community at risk, I probably put my job at risk, God forbid something horrible happened, but I followed the law. And I was really frustrated, and I wasn't going to allow that to happen again. So I left the bench, and I started making calls, and I found that Miami-Dade County actually has the largest percentage of people with mental illnesses of any urban area in the United States. It's actually 9.1% of our general population lives and suffers with serious mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression. And, it's almost 2 to 3 times the national average. And unfortunately, Florida is one of these states that just does not appropriately fund mental health services. We're either 49th or 50th per capita in funding. And so what's happened is the criminal justice system has clearly become the default system for people with mental illnesses. And it's terrible. It's torturous.
Which is a problem across the country.
Everywhere in the United States. We just had a lot more of it, but it is the same problem for every jail in the United States.
What type of offenses bring in people typically who may have a mental illness?
A lot of them are what we call quality of life offenses. Urinating in public, trespassing, disorderly intoxication type of charges. About 70 to 80% of the people with mental illnesses that get arrested also have a co-occurring disorder. So they have both their mental illness and a substance use issue. And so combined, those things will get them in. And if it's not one of those offenses, often it's a drug-related offense. But people with mental illnesses are no more violent than the general population. In fact, on medication, their prevalence for violence is much lower than the general population. And sadly, they're much more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators. And so there's so much stigma part of this as well, and there's such a lack of understanding and education among the stakeholders in the criminal system that we, in many ways, have tended to compound the problem or exacerbate the problem because we didn't understand it. And so after this experience that I had, I decided that there was probably a better way to handle the situation. And we were very fortunate. We worked with Hank Stedman and Policy Research Associates at the beginning, and we were able to get a grant for a technical assistance summit. And we brought all the stakeholders, and this was about 15 years ago, almost 16 years now. for a 2-day meeting, and we basically told them we weren't letting them out of the room until we figured out a better solution. So we had police chiefs and the sheriff and the public defender and the state attorney and judges, all the non-traditional mental health stakeholders that normally don't talk about these issues. And we literally mapped out how our criminal justice system intersected with our community mental health system. And what we realized is that we were embarrassingly dysfunctional. We were more of the problem. And one of the experts they brought in to help us was a guy from Seattle. He was great. And he told us a wonderful story they did in Seattle where they took the same type of people that I had in the room and they dropped them off at a local park in Seattle. And they took their shoes, their purses, their wallets, and their IDs. And they said, okay, you have a mental illness. Tomorrow morning you need to be at court at 9 o'clock. At 10:30 you need to go see your probation officer. At noon you need to see your psychiatrist, and at 2 o'clock you need to go pick up your medication. Good luck. And when you think about it in those terms, we built a system designed to fail. We didn't build a system for people that are actually ill.
Instead of supporting the people, we
Absolutely.
actually make it more difficult for them.
It is so fragmented and almost impossible to navigate even if you didn't have a mental illness. But when you put that on top of it, it really becomes an impossibility. But what's worse is we then punish them when they don't behave the way we expect, when we don't give them the opportunity or treatment for recovery. And so we decided we needed to design a system that made jail the last resort for people with mental illnesses, not the entry into the mental health system. And so we came up with a 2-part system. We wanted both pre and post arrest. We didn't want to be a magnet where people were getting better services if they got arrested, because families are so desperate that they'll get their loved one arrested if they think it's going to help. And we didn't want to do that. So we set up a very robust pre-arrest diversion program, modeled after what they did in Memphis called Crisis Intervention Team Policing. I now have over 4,600 police officers just in Miami-Dade now trained on how to identify someone with a serious mental illness, how to de-escalate the situation, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. It has been, there aren't enough words to use to describe the level of success. Shootings went down, police injuries went down, people started getting treatment instead of arrest. Our jail audit, that's the number of people in our jail, almost dropped in half because of what the police were doing. And so it had enormous, enormous success. We were able to reduce arrest for people with mental illnesses from about 72% to about 20% right now. The vast majority of people that we help do extremely well, and they don't come back into the criminal justice system. We get them their benefits, we get them housing, we get them appointments at their doctors, we get them clothes, we get them everything that they need, and we assign them a peer to help them redevelop relationships again. And, you know, and like any illnesses, there are levels, and some people are easier to get treated than others. But we're just becoming smarter and more sophisticated in how we handle it. But the program was so successful that our state attorney allowed us to expand it to our felony cases. So we now have a diversion program for nonviolent felony cases. It could be battery on a police officer, resisting with violence, cocaine possession, certain thefts, burglaries. And that program has been around for about 5 years, and the recidivism rate for those that complete the program, which is the vast majority, is only 6%. In fact, in some ways, what we have found is that people charged with the higher level of offenses are easier than the lower offenses, because a lot of the people we get with the lower offenses have been homeless and sick for many, many, many years. And they have totally severed ties with community and friends and family. And they're just really in bad shape. And so we're actually able to intervene at the higher crime level than we are at the lower crime level, sometimes a little easier. And then lastly, we set up a diversion program to keep people out of the Competency Restoration system. So when part of constitutional protection is that when you're arrested, you're entitled to a fair trial. It's in our Constitution. Well, if you're not competent to proceed, you can't have a fair trial. So 40 years ago, we set up these vast systems of forensic hospitalization to try to restore competency for people that got arrested on felonies. And at the time, there were very few people in jail with mental illnesses, so it made sense. But now that our criminal justice system has become the de facto mental health system, we're still using that same system. And it's overloading the states in cost, and it doesn't really do any good.
It doesn't help people.
It really doesn't help at all. In fact, Florida now spends about 25% of its entire adult mental health budget. It's about $135 million a year to restore competency for about 3,000 people. We have between 150 and 160,000 people in Florida who at the time of their arrest need acute mental health care treatment, and we're spending 25% to restore 3,000 people. And then once they're restored, most of them are on low-level felony offenses anyway. They get credit time served or probation, and they leave the courthouse without any access to treatment. So we convinced the state to try a new model and to take people who are charged with these lower-level felony offenses, instead of sending them up to a hospital where you're just going to restore them, keep them local in a locked facility, and instead of just emphasizing the restoration aspect, let's emphasize treatment and reintegration to the community. And it's been phenomenally successful. It's about a third cheaper, a third quicker. The recidivism is almost zero for about 5 years now. And we totally help the individual reintegrate back into the community. And it just makes a lot more sense. So the state is now looking to expand that on a statewide basis. But that's our 4th diversion program. We're also working on 2 other major projects, and that I think once we finally get this aspect of it done, we'll have as close to the ideal system for this population as you could probably have. And one of them is the taxpayers in Miami have been very generous to us, and they passed a bond issue for about $22 million to allow us to build the first of its kind forensic diversion facility. And so we were lucky. The Competency Restoration facility that was close to us got moved and was abandoned, and so the state basically gave it to us for $1 a year for $99, which I offer to pay every year. And it's a 180,000 square foot building. And what we're doing is we're going to have a centralized type receiving facility for the police to drop off. It's going to have a crisis unit, short-term residential facility. It's going to have a courtroom so that we can do cases right there. It's going to have a day activity program run by people with mental illnesses. It's going to have a primary healthcare unit so we can do a medical home model and take care of both the primary and psychiatric treatment. It's going to have, it has this magnificent kitchen, bigger than the studio, and we're going to put in a culinary supportive employment program so that we can teach employment skills. And so instead of just having them come into the criminal system, kick them out to the curb once we've adjudicated their case and expect them to get better, we will gently reintegrate them back into the community through this building. And so we're really excited. The architectural plans are done. We're in the process now of starting to look to get it actually constructed, and I'm hopeful in the next couple of years this facility will be up and running and will be a real model for that really difficult population.
Often family members are concerned about their loved one, where they don't know what to do. And unfortunately, their loved one gets involved in the criminal justice system. What do you suggest to parents, siblings, when their loved one does get involved in that system?
They should immediately contact usually the local public defender's office and let the lawyers know that the individual has a mental health issue. They should, if they work with NAMI, they should work with their local National Alliance for Mental Illness. At some point, I think it's important, judges are elected as well, and judges are usually pretty open to hearing from the public about these issues. And so I also recommend that people talk to the chief judge of the local circuit and see if they have some kind of mental health program. And if not, why not? And they should talk to their local county commissioner, their local psychiatric society member, and put pressure on the system to be more responsive, because it takes that sometimes to be able to make the structural changes. But we're trying to scale this nationally, and there are a lot of communities around the United States that are already doing parts of some of the things we're doing in Miami-Dade. And we really want to make this a national program.
With regards to training the police, tell me a little bit about that program.
It's really interesting because sometimes I teach every class. So, and we've had, gosh, 15 years now. I think I've missed 2 in 15 years. But sometimes I teach the first day and sometimes I teach the last day. And when I come in on the first day, they're like this. Their arms are crossed. They're, you know, some of them have been ordered to be there for the training.
What are you wasting my time with?
Exactly. This is fluffy. I'm a cop. You know, this is the last thing I want to be doing is touchy-feely crap. And so they're really, it's funny, their body language is so clear, right? And then when I come in and I teach the last day, they're laughing, they're hugging and kissing each other. They are totally open because I have the best trainer in the country. And she knows how to get through to people, particularly law enforcement. But so part of it is to help them understand themselves and their own trauma issues and help teach them why they feel the way they do often and why they're uptight sometimes and why they take it out at home. And remember, suicide, alcoholism, it's very high among law enforcement. And it's because of their own trauma. A lot of them are returning vets that have PTSD, they have secondary trauma from their jobs. And so the first thing we do is teach them about themselves. And, you know, people like that. But then we teach them what the distance should be, what kind of commands they shouldn't be doing, what kind of eye contact, what's going to trigger someone, what's going to, you know, make it better, what's going to make it worse. And we also teach them to think a little outside the box. That, you know, and I often tell a story about, I went through the modified training by the Memphis Police Department, their CIT. And it's a long story, so I can't probably do the whole thing on this, but the bottom line is, this 5-foot, 100-pound female police officer had to go in and handle this guy who had a violent past, who was like 6'5", 350 pounds, and when he was off his meds, his name was Bubba, he could be pretty aggressive. And she ended up cooking him lunch and was able to coax him out of the house to go get treatment. When a year earlier, it took 40 officers and a lot of force to get this poor guy out. And it's just rethinking how we approach the problem. You know, some of it's just common sense and a little decency. Engaging. But what you have to understand about police is that they're appropriately trained that when they encounter someone who's aggressive, they're supposed to become more aggressive to control the situation, which makes sense. You don't want them to get hurt. But when they're encountering someone who may be schizophrenic, hearing voices, who may have some ideations about law enforcement or CIA or some governmental entity, and here you are showing up with a badge and a gun, you're playing into their paranoia. And so we teach them, hey, 99 times, yes, you can become more aggressive. But when you're dealing with someone who may be paranoid by definition, don't feed it, reduce it. And so we teach them how to de-escalate. We teach them how to identify, de-escalate, and where to take them as opposed to arrest them. Our shootings of people with mental illnesses went from about one a month, to maybe 3 or 4 in the last 8 or 9 years. I mean, it's just stopped, and it's because of this training. And so everybody's won. In fact, the former mayor of Miami came up to me not too long ago, and he's like, Judge, you know, I wanted to thank you. We went to New York to get our bond rating improved. And this is after we had a lot of good construction downtown, a lot of, you know, before the big bottom fell out. He goes, I'm sitting there, I put on this 3-hour bells and whistles presentation about how great we're doing in Miami. And at the end of the 3 hours, the bond reviewers only had one question. They wanted to know how we got our police shootings down so significantly. And he's like, wow, it's CIT. And the reason that's important is communities are self-insured. So when police officers shoot somebody and there's a lawsuit, which invariably happens, the money from the lawsuit comes directly out of the taxpayer's pocketbook. And when you're shooting one person a month, it was hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue leaving the coffers, and it stopped. And it was because of this training. The other thing that unintended good benefit has been police injuries almost stopped, because they would escalate the situation and they'd end up having to use force to get it under control, and the officer would get hurt. And so worker comp claims almost stopped. And so it's just been a win-win. You know, sometimes doing the right thing really works, and this has been one of those situations.
Well, your passion, your expertise, your judgment has had a tremendous impact locally in Miami and across the country. And I want to thank you for all that you've done, all that you continue to do, and thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Nice to see you.
If your loved one becomes involved in the criminal justice system as a result of mental illness, I urge you to be proactive and communicate with authorities that their behaviors are the result of their illness and seek treatment. Remember, with help, there is hope. Until next time, I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Goodbye. With help, there is hope. Healthy Minds is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the Graham Beck Foundation, the New York State Psychiatric Association, and the New York State Office of Mental Health.